had a couple of previous interviews with the folks from the committee in regards to the federal budget. And Mike, we appreciate very much your appearance on the program this morning, and we welcome you to the show. This is Rob. Thanks for being with us.
Rob, good to be with you, and Admiral, good to be with you as well.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Well, Mike, what do you make of the latest edition of the budget that's being debated in Washington, D.C., and what changes do you expect to the current draft of it, and what changes are you actually hoping for?
So, Rob, I think you're referring to what everyone knows as the Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Yes, sir.
That they are moving forward in Washington, which includes lots of different components. It includes increased spending on immigration and investment, includes energy policy, includes increased spending in defense. It includes the extension of the tax cuts that were passed during the first Trump administration, that many of which were set to expire at the end of this year. It includes additional tax provisions that President Trump put forward during his campaign and is looking to deliver on, such as no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, things like that. And so that bill is making its way through Congress. A version of it passed the House, and it is actively being debated in the Senate, and they have a deadline of trying to pass it by July 4th. But as a group of ourselves who cares about fiscal responsibility, and primarily we are really concerned about the growth in our federal deficit and debt, we're concerned about this bill. This bill is projected to add upwards of $3 trillion additional dollars to our debt when you count interest over the next 10 years. If you assume some of the provisions in the bill that are set to expire in a few years, the no taxes on tips, overtime, things like this, they've set to expire by 2028. If you assume those don't expire and they go permanent, which politically a lot of people assume that probably would happen, that grows to $5 trillion in additional debt over 10 years. So we're very concerned about this and think they need to make changes to pay for the cost of this at minimum, but also start to put an actual down payment on getting our debt under control.
Mike, the Congressional Budget Office also has projections that say this adds to the debt. The White House says their numbers are all wrong. But Congress says their numbers are wrong. They failed to take in the dynamic scoring of the tax cuts. And you say that their numbers are wrong as well. Who's right and who's wrong in this disagreement?
Well, we believe we're right, and the reason we do is a few things. First off, one of the critiques that they have of the Congressional Budget Office in terms of how they're accounting for the cost of this bill is they're saying that the extension of the tax cuts that are due to expire at the end of this year, that they shouldn't be counting those as a cost. Because this is just current policy. We're just extending current policy. And so therefore, we don't have to count that as a cost. The issue there is the Congressional Budget Office, by rule, has to actually judge by a current law baseline. And what that means is they have to judge based on what the law is on the books, and those are set to expire. But actually, the more important thing, Rob, is that when they passed the tax cuts in 2017, they intentionally set many of the provisions to expire this year to keep the cost down. Because they knew it cost a lot of money, so they had them expire. Well, if you didn't count the cost then, and you don't count the cost now, you're not counting the cost at all, and that's to the tune of about $4 trillion or so of additional revenue loss. So that's one issue that they have. The other issue you pointed out, Rob, is they say that the CBO doesn't take into account the economic growth effects. And that's partly true. In the actual score they did last week, there was not what they call dynamic effects of how much growth could be generated by this bill to help offset some of the costs. However, they can request, and it's possible that CBO may give a dynamic estimate soon, but there's been plenty of other outside dynamic estimates from groups across the board, including more conservative-leaning groups. And at most, the economic growth that they say this would generate is about 700 billion at most. Most of them actually have it less than that, a couple hundred billion. Some actually score it as being a negative on economic growth because of the debt. So that's at best 700 billion. That doesn't come close to closing the gap of a $3 trillion debt. So I understand the critiques. They're invalid in a few ways, and like I said, we obviously think we're right on this.
Bill?
Yeah, Mike, for us that are not economic experts, we get confused very quickly, and everybody throws out different numbers. But from my naive perspective, to get a control of the debt, you've got to do two things. You've got to stimulate growth, and that's the Republicans say this is happening. The other way is you've got to reduce spending, and that's the component that I'm not seeing. That it's the reduction in spending, I think, is less than $100 billion, or $800 billion is what we see in reduction in spending. And that, if you look at it, the size of the deficit is quite small. So what do you see from the reduced spending aspect of this bill?
So first off, Admiral, you're absolutely correct. This stuff's kind of complicated, but it actually is simple when you get to the levers of what you got to do. You got to look at both sides of the ledger. You got to look at your spending side on the budget, and you got to look at your revenue side. Now, you're pointing out on the revenue side, some of that can come from economic growth, right? So economic growth, you can generate more revenue. We were kind of just talking about that in the previous question. So you got to look at both sides of the equation. And on the spending side, you're correct on the sort of the magnitude that's in here. So there's been claims by the proponents of this bill that this is a historic spending reduction. Now, let's put that in context. The federal government is projected to spend upwards of about $86 trillion total over the next decade of which this bill would be enacted. Right, so that's cumulatively over the next 10 years or so. This reduces spending somewhere in the 1.3 trillion to 1.4 trillion in outlay reductions over the next 10 years. But if you add in the interest expense that would offset that, which results in more debt, it comes down to, you pointed this out, Admiral, it's around 700 or so we estimate actual spending reduction. So that's less than 700 billion on an $86 trillion spending base. That's less than 1% spending reduction. So yes, we obviously think they can go further than that. They need to reduce spending. They also need to look at the revenue side too. You can generate growth, but the other way you can look at the revenue side, and I know it's not popular, but when you look at the tax code has trillions and trillions of what I would call backdoor spending. They are tax expenditures. These are loopholes, deductions, credits, et cetera, that make the tax code ridiculously inefficient, treat people differently, treat companies differently across the tax code. It's not fair. And you can clean out a lot of those provisions and help generate revenue by getting rid of some of that backdoor spending. So you got to look at both sides, spending, revenues, but there's a lot more work this bill can do on the spending side.
You mentioned the tax code and the backdoor spending. Every few years, there's a lot of noise or press being given. We're going to look hard at the tax code. I'm not hearing that now. Is that still being worked in the background? It's certainly not been discussed up front of redoing the tax code.
Yeah, no. Unfortunately, it's somewhat the opposite right now with this bill. What's happened with a lot of the new provisions that are actually in this bill, I was mentioning them before, that relate to some of the things that the president was promising during his campaign: the no taxes on tips, the no taxes on overtime, these kind of provisions. They're actually complicating the tax code even more, and they're inefficient. And so, no, it's actually adding more complexity to the tax code in the way they're doing this. And a lot of these things, as I mentioned before, are actually set to expire in a few years because, again, they're trying to keep the cost down. So they're trying to set some of these things to expire. And that adds complication, too. It doesn't allow people to plan over the next several years. So, unfortunately, the idea of what you're referring to, Admiral, is what people have called like sort of comprehensive tax reform. Let's look under the tax code. Let's get rid of a bunch of these deductions, credits, exclusions, exemptions. When you do that, you could actually lower rates across the board, because you can take some of that revenue and use it to lower some rates, simplify the code. That's been a goal for a long time. Unfortunately, it's not being talked about right now. In fact, it's the opposite. We're going to make it more complicated, less pro-growth.
Yeah, you picked up on the fact a couple of new tax benefits, and it's going to be more complicated, more involved. But yet, the staff at IRS, Internal Revenue, is being decreased by approximately 35%, and that group would be the ones to be looking at the waste, fraud, and abuse, would they not? So how are you going to address the complexity of the tax code with fewer individuals?
So that's true. They in the last couple of years, there's been efforts to try to defund, reduce spending at the IRS, and all estimates suggest that when doing that, it actually it can seem like you're saving money, right? Because you're cutting spending that's going towards the staff at the IRS. But actually, most people that estimate this and score this is the word will show that it actually increases the deficit when you do that. Because as you're alluding to, that if you have less resources to going after folks that are trying to evade taxes, it causes what they call the tax gap to grow, which the tax gap is the difference between what should be getting received in taxes and what actually does when you take into account people that are evading taxes. So yes, that needs to be dealt with. We shouldn't be cutting out the IRS. Now that being said, I think there is ways to utilize technology better. People have been pointing out that the growth of AI, there might be ways to make this much more efficient, so you don't have to have as much maybe headcount sort of doing this as in the past. So all those things have, from a technological standpoint, are going to play out in the coming years. But right now, with the way that they have cut some of the IRS spending, yeah, it is a concern that it actually will make this harder in the near term.
I've heard recently the projection that by 2050 our debt will exceed $50 trillion. Is that numbers that you can subscribe to?
Oh, it's going to reach $50 trillion much sooner than 2050. So we kind of jumped right into the conversation about this bill without putting it in the context of sort of the current fiscal situation, Admiral, as you're referring to. Right now, before this bill even gets passed, put this bill aside, our debt as a percentage of our economy, which is the way we look at it. You measure your public debt outstanding on the markets relative to the size of your economy, because your economy is your underlying ability to service that. Our debt is almost it's not the entire size of our economy right now. It's going to surpass the record levels we ever had as a public debt as a percentage of the economy, which was right after World War II, in just a couple of years. But the big difference was when we had that debt during World War II, we were borrowing to defend the free world, and it was projected to come down. Now we're borrowing for our current consumption, and it's projected to go up as far as the eye can see. We are, based on current projections, set to borrow an additional $22 trillion over the next 10 years. That's before we account for anything as it relates to the Big Beautiful Bill Act. Interest spending on that national debt is approaching $1 trillion annually about this year. We spend more on interest payments on that national debt right now than we do on defense. So we're actually going to hit that 50 trillion mark much sooner, within the next decade or so. But it's much more serious than that based on where the numbers are right now.
Mike Murphy is our guest here on the program, Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And Mike, when I look at the work that Elon Musk was supposed to be doing in Washington, D.C., and all you can come up with out of a $2 trillion goal of federal spending cuts is about $70 billion in verifiable cuts, and that might even be a generous number. And you project that over the next 10 years, as you do with budgets, that comes to $700 or $800 billion. Is the conclusion that we can draw that DOGE was inefficient in looking for actual things to cut, or that there wasn't as much to cut as everybody thought? Which of those two is more accurate?
I think it's probably a little bit leaning towards the second of those two, and I'll explain why. So when they first came in and set up DOGE, we as a fiscal responsibility group, we welcomed it. We put out statements saying, if you want to get under the hood and state as a goal to get the government more efficient, to save the taxpayers money, because the first step here, from it comes from a leadership standpoint, is you got to put things on the agenda. So for them putting that out there as a goal, we thought was critically important before they even got to the sort of details on how they were going to approach it. But what happened is that I think what happened is once you get under the hood and trying to figure out how they were trying to generate savings within the scope of that we were doing. It's actually just not where the money is. So they were focusing all on sort of the administrative side of this, reducing headcount, trying to squeeze savings from within the agencies. And that, yeah, I mean, at most, you could eliminate everybody, all civilian workers, and it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, again, in the context of an almost $2 trillion annual deficit. The money is in the actual programs. And that's not what their scope was. Their scope was not to, slow the growth or actually change programs. To actually change programs and programmatic spending, you got to go through Congress. And from a projected spending growth perspective, about 87% of the built-in projected spending growth in the federal budget, 87% over the next 10 years, is due to three things. It's due to interest spending, which I already talked about, because that's just kind of growing on itself as we have more debt and higher interest rates. It's due to health care program spending, so Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, and it's due to Social Security. So Social Security, health care spending, and interest on the debt account for 87% of spending growth. That's nowhere within the scope of what DOGE was attacking. And so I do think, Rob, it's more towards your second point. It's once they got in there, I think they realized that's not where the money is. And it's just the money's not there if you're going to reach some of those bigger goals, despite the fact that they had absolutely the right goal they were trying to achieve.
And Mike, this was our point. Bill and I talked about this a couple of months ago, that you've got some pretty major sized vessels in the federal government that are difficult to turn around. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which you mentioned a minute ago, the national debt, interest.
And I'd add defense as well.
And defense spending. And those are the rest of that discretionary spending. There's not enough there to save $2 trillion. So my next point on that then is, I think that this country is 1 foot in the pool and 1 foot out on the cement as to what we are and what we want to be. We have these European models of social welfare that we've established through FDR up to LBJ and even George Bush 43, right? But we don't want to fund them. We're cutting taxes as much as we possibly can while the baby boom moves through these social welfare programs and consumes even more tax dollars. You don't have to be an MIT math major to figure out that those two things don't go together.
It's absolutely correct. I think, let me elaborate on this one a little bit and just use Social Security as the example, because I think this is a good one to elaborate on your point. And the reason I'm talking about Social Security too is like this, kind of going back to the Admiral's point earlier. The budget, the debt, it's really complicated. It's actually very difficult to kind of understand and how the debt and deficit impacts people. But people understand Social Security. When we go around the country and we talk about the debt and deficit, we bring up Social Security, people's eyes kind of open up and they start paying attention more. Social Security as a program in and of itself is on a path to insolvency. So within 7 years, the scheduled benefits are not going to be able to be paid because the revenues are not going to be adequate to pay those benefits. We've known this for years. It's largely due to aging demographics. We haven't adjusted the program for the fact that the baby boomers, as you said, have been retiring in massive amounts, and we haven't adjusted it accordingly. By law, they will have to reduce benefits in that year by over 20%. That's a $16,500 cut for a median income couple on the program. You say that to people, it gets their attention. The reason I'm bringing it up to you, Rob, is this is what we believe really needs to happen to get Washington to wake up. The regular folks out there need to understand what the implications of some of this is on their pocketbooks. If we don't solve Social Security, it's heading towards insolvency. Politicians that are out there saying that their position on Social Security is we're not touching Social Security. That position is guaranteeing a 20% across the board cut within 7 years. And the earlier you solve this problem, the much easier it is to solve. The changes will be less drastic, less across the board, and you can phase things in. So that's what we need to do. We need to get people focused on some of these issues, specifically things like Social Security that they can understand, and demand that our politicians tell us the truth about this. Stop telling us talking points about the fact that you're not going to touch it.
Yeah, Mike, the question at hand right now, big, beautiful bill. What should the Senate do?
10 seconds, Mike.
The Senate needs to go back to the drawing board. They need to add more savings, make sure they're paying for the cost of this bill, and then put more down, a down payment to actually get this debt under control.
Thank you, Mike. Good segment. Much
Thanks,
appreciated.
Mike. Very good.
Thank you both. Great to be with you.